This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Been stewing on this intro for a while now. I just have those days where it's time to actually sit down and record the show. Got all the notes typed up here for the shows. I've at least got some idea of how I want to break everything down. And then I go to hit the recording function and I'm like, wait, I did not plan an intro. I think I brought this up before on the podcast, but for whatever reason, just decided to mention it again because that's kind of where we are right now. I'm, guess you could say, shooting from the hip. We'll do it live. Right, Bill? Right. There are certain videos that I can always go back and watch if I'm having a bad day, and they'll always put a smile on my face. That and listening to Mark Briscoe do the weather report. Never gets old. So, what are we doing today? Well, we got the usual Friday format. No bells and whistles for this one. This weekend is going to be a little different as we prepare for the Monday show, because there will not be a Retro Raw report. So I will be doing the SmackDown review for Monday, and then the following week's show, that'll be where we do the WrestleMania 10 pay-per-view recap. I've already slivered out a few hours in my schedule this weekend to make sure that I actually have the time to sit down and watch it. That'll give me enough time to do a thorough deep scrub, get my notes prepped for next week, and then by the time next weekend rolls around, I can just watch the Retro Raw and SmackDown shows and not subject myself to having to watch 7 to 8 hours worth of wrestling content in 2 days. Because ain't nobody got time for that. Alrighty. Well then. How's everybody doing? Y'all ready for another stellar installment of Tommy sitting here and ranting about how ineffective and futile Dynamite is? Because it sure was that. And probably a few other adjectives I could include. Don't make me break out the dictionary again. I'll run down every term from A to Z. That'll be the entire Dynamite report. Just 30 minutes of me trying to find every word to possibly describe how dumb this show is every week. Quite frankly, I don't even think 30 minutes is enough. I might need at least double that amount of time. I don't know. I mean, it's not even like it was the worst show of all time, but now we'll get into it. There were plenty of problems, most of which came right out of the gate with how they opened the show. And I'm not just including that because of the parties involved. We'll get to it. Let me quickly say, though, if you're checking out the show for the first time, make sure you comment, rate, subscribe, all that good stuff. We're also on Rumble if you prefer to watch us on a secondary platform. These days, I can't blame you if you do. But we have 2 weekly podcasts on both video sites, so feel free to pick and choose whichever one suits you better. It's funny, I've checked the status report on both my channels in the last week or so. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, my Rumble viewership is slowly increasing, and the YouTube viewership kind of stagnates. It's just, I don't know. I mean, I've complained about the algorithms before on YouTube and how it's basically just a set up to fail system no matter what kind of videos you're making these days. It's just, the landscape is completely changed. YouTube is not what it used to be. It used to be an actual video platform where people could grow their channels, and I don't know. Now it's just, it's not based on subscriptions or any of that stuff now. It's all based on thumbnails and titles. Like, again, if you're already not popular on YouTube by the year 2023, it's just, there's basically no hope for you, which is kind of the way it is. But it is what it is. That's why we have Rumble as a secondary streaming site, so you can watch stuff over there too. But we're on Mondays and Fridays. We cover modern and classic wrestling, which is also part of today's podcast. Probably the stuff that I most look forward to talking about, but I got to make things at least fun and enjoyable for some people out there. The Dynamite reports are kind of like how I've coined the SmackDown reviews, guilty pleasure watches. Like, I know they're going to be awful most weeks, but they're still entertaining things that get shuffled about during those 2-hour trudges. They're rare, but they do exist. The question is, did any of it exist with Dynamite this week? Well, as expected, since this is AEW we're talking about here, we just had a pay-per-view on Sunday night. A lot happened. You might figure they'd possibly want to open the program by, I don't know, recapping the pay-per-view in some form or manner. Maybe drawing our attention to some of the more notable moments. Daring to even acknowledge the fact that there was a pay-per-view that happened 3 days prior. Guess that made too much sense for our genius booker of the year. Went way over his head. So naturally, they immediately pitch it to the ring for a match. And hey, wouldn't you know it, it's Orange Cassidy. Big surprise there. What are we at now? 3 weeks in a row this cretin's been thrown out there to start the program? I mean, let's just say the quiet part out loud, if it wasn't obvious beforehand. Tony Khan has an unhealthy infatuation with this guy. Either that or he actually thinks this guy is a ratings draw. Any way you look at it, he's a fucking idiot if he thinks that to be the case. If you care, he wrestled Jay Lethal, which I think was their third or fourth match they've had in the last year. Even though AEW will constantly sit there and tell you they don't do rematches. Not like those pesky WWE bookers that'll book the same guys to wrestle week after week after week on television. So that was the opener. 25 minutes of TV time this took up. But hey, they make it easy on me. More power to them. That's 25 less minutes of AEW I have to subject myself to. Where this motherfucker does the same boring, repetitive, non-funny shtick he's been doing for the better part of 3 years. Could have spent those 3 years actually trying to hit the gym and develop some kind of physique. Maybe look like a professional wrestler in some form or fashion. Instead, he's been playing with his own dick and making a mockery of the sport. Some things never change. Yet Tony Khan will insist on giving this guy screen time over the guys that are actually talented, which I know for AEW is slim pickings, but out of an entire roster of 328 guys, I can name 327 other wrestlers that are 10 times the skill level of Orange fucking Cassidy. I'll even put Chucklefuck Taylor above this guy. I'll put Danhausen above this guy. Actually, no, I take it back. Fuck Danhausen, too. They both can go sodomize themselves with a rusty fishing blade. I'm just going to move on from this. I've already given this segment more attention than it's warranted. For the record, yes, I did catch a glimpse of the announce team accidentally getting signaled over the house speakers. It's AEW. What do you expect? WCW had less technical glitches than what goes on in a given week with this company. God almighty. Just keep hashing out the next Botchamania compilation. AEW giving you content for years. So after that complete waste of 30 minutes, we had Powerhouse Hobbs in the back with Renee Paquette for an interview. First, he touched on a random video they showed seconds prior where someone had allegedly broken into Wardlow's car and stole all of his shit. And if we're led to believe that the person filming this was Wardlow holding an iPhone or something, I will say he was very calm, cool, and collected about it. Just casually moving the camera back and forth like, oh, look at that. Shoot. Someone broke into my car and stole my gear. Oh well. Guess this will make for riveting television on Dynamite. Let me send this over to Tony Khan. Aside from that, Hobbs did a really solid promo. Talked about how Wardlow lost his gear and belongings, and while he still might have his TNT championship, Hobbs is going to make sure that he puts an end to that tonight. Write that one down, by the way. We will come back to it. In the meantime, guess we know what's next on the agenda for Ricky Starks. Came out first promo, got a huge ovation from the crowd, total megastar. He's talking about how he beat Jericho at Revolution and he's ready to move on. Thank God. Everyone can breathe a sigh of relief about that. And it looks like the cards are coming into play here. He's asking, what's next for Ricky Starks? Everyone's going, MJF, MJF. So naturally, he gets laid out by Juice Robinson. So then we came back from a Wardlow promo, sporting the FTR sleeveless top here, since his car was broken into. Needed some apparel to borrow. Cash and Dax to the rescue to sell some tees. That was actually a really clever merch plug. And Wardlow's pumping up his match with Hobbs for the title later on. Trying to give it a big fight feel. I'm like, well, they're going out of their way to try to hard sell this thing. And it's going to be false count anywhere. Why? Why not? Why not add a random, completely unnecessary, no DQ stipulation to a title match when it was totally uncalled for and made absolutely no sense? After we literally just saw a pay-per-view 3 days prior that had coffins and shovels and chairs and barbed wire and chains and bricks and forks, almost every plunder implement ever devised by the human hand. Now let's just make it falls count anywhere, anything goes. Because Tony can't help himself. He's got the worst case of ADHD in modern recorded history. You know, the day Tony Khan can actually go one full episode of television without booking some kind of hardcore, no DQ, anything goes stipulation match, I think that'll be the day that I actually grow concerned about this guy's overall well-being. So after that, we had Ruby Riot's green hair come down to explain why she randomly decided to swerve everybody at the pay-per-view and side with Saraya and Toni Storm. As to be expected, the answer was basically, let's come up with about 47 different subtle, contrived story details that nobody remembers in order to try and validate something that made absolutely no sense in execution. She talked about her losing a title match to Britt Baker, and Britt got cheered, despite her being the heel at the time, which I had no memory of. Then she talked about beating Chris Statlander in the semifinals of the Owen Hart tournament and getting booed out of the building, which I didn't have any memory of. Then she mentioned something about when Toni Storm was the interim women's champion and how AEW couldn't even recognize her as the legitimate champion, which I do have vague memories of, although Tony's actual title reign Yeah, I don't remember anything about that. It did leave me wondering, though, where the hell is Thunder Rosa at? Wasn't the whole interim champion drama a result of her completely vanishing from television after faking some kind of injury? And then we never heard from her again? Good times. But yeah, the simple answer to why Ruby turned heel was the fans did it to me. Which is like every cop-out heel turn rationalization we've gotten from WWE in the last 15 years. The fans made me do it. It's your fault. Blame yourselves. I think I also heard Ruby say something in here about how the fans were begging for Saraya to come out of retirement before she signed with AEW. No, they weren't. I can't think of a single wrestling personality or fan out there that was actively advocating for Saraya to come out of retirement to wrestle. Nobody wanted that. Then she claimed how her and the rest of the former WWE rejects are going to rebuild the girls' division, which I had a very long belly laugh at. Yeah, good luck with that. If it's supposed to start with her beating up all the underneath green rookies on the female roster, maybe she should try winning her matches in shorter order. Maybe instead of taking 8 minutes through commercial to beat a homegrown original, while at the same time being somewhat competitive with her, the heat might actually be garnered if she, say, won in 2 minutes? Maybe less? And she didn't sell at any point? But I don't know. Call me old school. Call me someone that has no idea what I'm talking about. So yeah, can't wait for that exhilarating story to dominate the girls' segments on this show. Disgruntled WWE rejects versus a bunch of green, inexperienced AEW originals. That ought to get those ratings sailing through the roof. Or, they could just try cutting the women's division entirely and quit forcing it on the show when all it does is run people off in spades. That might be a better idea. But again, I revert back to my original comment. Call me old school. So at approximately 50-something minutes into the show, closing in on hour 2, finally was the point where they even bothered to acknowledge the AEW World Champion's existence, putting on that great main event match with Bryan Danielson that stole the show and left everyone with good feelings after it was over. Yeah, let's not start the show with MJF, the single biggest star in the company and one of their top draws, if not the top draw at this stage in the game. Instead, let's prostrate the company mascot out there for the 83rd week in a row. Because Tony's a fucking mark. And of course, the only physical appearance of MJF on the entire show, the biggest star in the company, he gets a 30-second pre-tape, letting us know that he'll be back on the show next week to celebrate his birthday on Dynamite in Winnipeg. Fucking Christ, I hope they're not about to book him in a program with Jericho. For the love of God, please keep those guys away from each other. The problem is that I know how the guy works. And it normally doesn't lend itself to a lot of hope and promise whenever Jericho latches onto hot prospects. In fact, it usually goes south in a hurry. Oh, well, we'll talk about Jericho in a while. He might be preoccupied in Winnipeg next week, so we might not have to worry about him confronting MJF. Thank God for small favors, but as soon as I heard MJF even mention the town Winnipeg, I was like, oh, no. No. It was either him or Omega, but I don't think Omega's going to play MJF's game either, so good. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, if we come to it. Let's talk about this FTR promo. Hot damn, they're back. And they're white hot. I think they may be arguably more over now than they were at any point prior to their disappearance from the show. Probably because the people recognize how badly Tony Khan has botched the run in the last 2 years. Just another prime example of him having no clue how to capitalize on guys' success. Plus, you factor in the Beta Bucks' influence on how FTR get treated and handled on television. I mean, they've been fighting an uphill war since day one on arrival. And man, even with the way these guys deliver their promos on TV, it just comes off like a natural promo you'd hear from guys in the territory days. It's not artificial dialogue. It doesn't sound fake or rehearsed or scripted out. It's two serious guys talking business and selling everybody on their journey and where they're headed next. You know, Cash says it's been a rough few months for them. They've eaten a lot of losses. They haven't been at their best. They lost one of their best friends in Jay Briscoe a couple months ago. So they needed to step away and regroup for a while. But in their absence, they got so sick of hearing Austin and Colton come out and act like a bunch of spoiled brats every week. They're self-entitled assholes that have been fed the silver spoon their entire careers. They got no respect. And now it's time for Dax and Cash to beat some respect into those ass boys, like their father should have done to them a long time ago. You know, Dax says that he loves the industry way too much, and while he's not out there to give a standard white meat rah-rah babyface promo, he's here to right a previous wrong with his partner Cash. After they closed the book on one of the best tag team trilogies in modern wrestling history, the Guns tried to steal their thunder by laying them out after the match, and now FTR have to right that wrong, not just by beating the ass boys in a match, but by beating them where it hurts, beating them for the AEW World Tag Team Championships. And of course, this gets a nuclear reaction after it's over. For like 5 minutes on this program, AEW Dynamite was the best wrestling show the entire week, bar none. All because Cash and Dax are professionals that know how to go out there and sell everybody on story implication and match importance. The only question I asked myself when it was over, gee, you think it would have been nice if they'd have done this exact same promo back in like early February? So they could have maybe built to, I don't know, say a pay-per-view match with the Guns and FTR that could have actually sold tickets and additional buys? Instead of doing a random haphazard four-way at the pay-per-view with teams that won a bunch of random qualifying matches, both of which were horrible and complete waste of TV time? Just a thought. But what do I know? I'm just some geek on the internet that bitches about how wrestling doesn't make a lick of sense anymore. Speaking of things that made no sense, Chris Jericho, Sammy Guevara, and Daniel Garcia beat Top Flight and AR Fox in a completely random trios match. Also, they could then declare themselves the number one contenders for the trios titles, completely at random, only to then get interrupted by the Elite, who stake their claim as the number one contenders, even though they lost clean at the pay-per-view. And then the House of Black accepted the challenge to both teams for next week on Dynamite. Can anyone figure out who the fucking good guys and bad guys are in this situation? So much for that tangent I did on the Elite at the pay-per-view, right? Talking about how better served they might be if they actually bothered to contribute to the product by conducting professional business with the actual stars. But, nah, how silly of me to think that the Bucks and Omega were going to do anything except stick in their little camp of playmates. And I guess we can add the JAS Jag-offs to that conversation. And we've got the House of Drek, the Elite, and the JAS all in the ring together at the same time. 3 of the biggest collective wastes of space on the entire show. And they'll all be mercifully paired together next week in one segment. Makes it easier for me to skip right over that tumbling routine fiasco. And that was followed with another super big, super exciting, super important Tony Khan special announcement. You know, since the last super big, super exciting, super important Tony Khan special announcement that was neither big, nor exciting, nor important, nor special. And as for this, all of the above terminology included announcement, next week on Dynamite, it's Orange Cassidy versus Jeff Jarrett for the soon-to-be defunct Mid-Atlantic, some but not all of the Atlantic Championship. Because Tony Khan finally realized how fucking stupid that title name was. So after, I don't know, give or take 6 months, now they're finally going to rebrand to the AEW International Championship. Yes, I'm not kidding. That was the big grand announcement. AEW is renaming a belt that nobody gives a flying fuck about. Epic. And then came the point in the show that just left me bewildered beyond all comprehension. We get this VTR with Bryan Danielson post-Revolution. He's beaten, bloody, totally dejected, having lost the Iron Man match. He's recounting everything that happened at the end, saying that he's built an entire legacy out of fighting and never giving up. But when Danielson was in the LeBell Lock, he realized that he could not feel his arms anymore, and after the reality set in that Danielson was putting himself before his wife and kids, it dawned on him that MJF promised that he would make sure Danielson could never play with his kids again. So, therefore, he had to tap out for the betterment of his family. And now for him, it is time to go home. And it's at that point that they cut back to the ring. The announcers spend, I believe I counted, 8 seconds of recapping that entire pre-tape. And as per usual with AEW booking, it's on to the next thing. I mean, I can't even really say I was bewildered by the end of it. It's just, what do you say? Typical Tony Khan booking. And I know I always revert back to that same fucking talking point, but really, what else is there to say? Everything with the way the show is formatted and structured, from beginning to end, it's bam, 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 rapid fire, on to the next thing. Shit happens, on to the next thing. Everything's just go, 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 from start to finish. These people have no clue or concept of how to let anything sink in. What the hell's going on with Bryan Danielson? Is he okay? What does he mean when he says, it's time for me to go home? Well, maybe if you tried to actually stay on something for a long period of time, give it a chance to breathe, maybe we could have revisited that talking point throughout the show. Instead of just moving on with the next piece of business like the Danielson part was just another segment on the show. Because that's all it was by the end of the day. Bryan Danielson's loss to MJF for the AEW World title at the pay-per-view, their chance to sell us on the grief and anguish of Danielson's loss, just another part of the show. Just a 20-second VTR of Danielson contemplating his future, and then it's next. Could have been the end of his career for all we know. This could have been a retirement speech. But the announcers are like, oh, well, hopefully Danielson's all right. Well, anyway, on with the next part of the program. Good God. No wonder nothing has any long-term meaning or effect in this company. So remember when I was hoping that Jon Moxley losing to Adam Page in that garbage hardcore match at the pay-per-view was their way of strategically writing this idiot off the show for a while? Well, not only was the idiot back on TV several days later, after an alleged grueling Texas death match, but he was back on the show wrestling. Totally fine. Not even bothering to sell the effects of being bludgeoned to death with bricks, smashed with barbed wire chairs, getting run through barbed wire boards, and getting choked out with a chain. After all that, now he's just back wrestling 3 days later on Dynamite, like it's another day at the office for the oil mechanic. And of course, it's with the fucking job order dorks. Seriously. I can merely speculate how their viewership drops from week to week on this show. Hard to imagine people wanting to turn the show off in droves. With all the other nonsensical bullcrap going on most weeks, and here they are in hour 2 booking a job order match. Through a commercial break, no less. Yeah, I got nothing. Beats me how they're losing viewers every week. Going on, 3 years of this horse crap? With a Dark Order. One of the dumbest gimmick ideas ever perpetrated on a wrestling show. And they're just going to keep on forcing it and forcing it and forcing it up our sphincters. Oh, but there's more. If you thought the rant ended there, we haven't even scratched the surface. Because after Moxley and Claudio win, the now villain group of the BCC begin attacking the job order dweebs. And who should come out to make the save but fucking Hangman Adam Page? Are you kidding? This feud is still fucking going on? How? Just how? They did everything to each other at the pay-per-view except literally nail the other guy's balls to a step stool. You're telling me after all that shit, after the bricks and the chains and the barbed wire boards and the goddamn forks, Tony Khan looked at that and said, "This feud must continue." Why? Why? This fucking sent me over the edge. I was mostly numb to the AEW stupidity this week. This one set me off. I literally almost chucked my TV out the window when I saw this. How on God's green earth they can let this feud continue after everything we saw them do to each other at the pay-per-view. Beyond me. Beyond all comprehension. They booked a Texas death match with Page and Moxley just so they can turn around and probably wind up booking some kind of 6-man tag that'll probably get blown off on TV in a few weeks. Because that's really enticing on paper. 2 job order fucks and Hangman Page versus a heel Blackpool Combat Club with Flat Wheel Yuta getting thrown in there. It really is kind of amazing when you think about it. Tony Khan does the polar opposite of what should ever be done in a scenario. You book 2 guys in a grueling hardcore grudge match just so you could turn around less than 4 days later and tease that the program is going to continue. But now in tag team competition, instead of doing what should have probably been done, you know, getting these slap nuts off of TV so we can get a break from them. Nope. Said they're right back on the show, none the worse for wear. No one's selling, no one's bruised, no one's bothering to tape up any body parts. Paige had a black eye, but I don't even know if that was real or if that was a makeup job. Pretty sure it was makeup. Christ almighty. So yeah, get ready for Paige versus Moxley, installment number 372. But this time, it counts. This time, it'll be a regular singles match. Because they've already done Texas Death. So naturally, that means the next step is, what? A wrestling match? A standard one-on-one catch-as-catch-can pro wrestling bout? Perhaps a verbal debate? Good God in heaven. Then came time for the main event. The only match on the show that I think I actually even bothered watching, looking back. Oh, God. Just realized that. Yeah, this is the only match that I watched in the entire show. Wow. And I have no idea why, of all matches on the program, I chose to watch the garbage plunder match. And it was indeed, how you say, a plunder match. They brawled hither and yon. It started in the parking lot where both guys slammed each other into shit for a while. They waited until about 2 minutes into the actual brawl to actually bother ringing the bell to start the fucking thing. And I think they fought for all of about 2.5 minutes before they pitched a commercial break. It eventually spilled back into the ring and broke into a wrestling match, after we literally just saw both guys throwing each other through car doors, smashing gimmicks over the other guy's head, brawling throughout the arena to even get back into the ring. Then about 5 minutes later, I'm watching Hobbs give Wardlow a double-A spine buster, which Wardlow no-sold and just stood right back up 2 seconds later. Then they started trading fake blows and going back and forth with more wrestling maneuvers. Meanwhile, the crowd is chanting for tables, because modern wrestling is retarded. It took me until about halfway through the match to even realize that despite Hobbs getting cheered throughout the whole thing, I think Wardlow was supposed to be the babyface. Wardlow ended up giving Hobbs a diving senton through a table on the floor. Of course, that was only a 2 count, because they had to build to the climax of the match, you see. The table bump was actually only a build to the finish, which was one of the more illogical, incomprehensible things AEW has probably ever done in modern recorded history. Think about the ground that covers. Because they have Wardlow brawl to the top of the ramp with Hobbs, and they make their way over to the announcer's table, and as Wardlow goes to set up Hobbs for a powerbomb, who should run in from behind to clock Wardlow with a chair but QT Marshall? And I actually wrote that down as a form of exasperation in my notes. Not QT Marshall with one question mark, but QT Marshall with multiple exclamation points and question marks, followed by a giant "what the fuck" in all caps, wherein the announcer's justification for this run-in angle that made absolutely no sense was something to the effect of Tony Schiavone saying, well, you know, you guys remember Ricky Starks, and then there was the one thing where, and when it became abundantly clear that Tony had no idea where the fuck he was going in that conversation, I think he just gave up trying. Probably should have just said, nah, fuck it, it makes no sense. Who cares? Something about QT promising Hobbs that his word was his bond. You know, from like that 10-second angle they shot on Rampage like 9 months ago that nobody remembers. Yeah, that one. Because you all remember that, right? We all remember that legendary backstage angle with QT Marshall and Powerhouse Hobbs. You know, what are you going to do? It's the sinking Titanic we're dealing with, people. Just enjoy the decline. So yeah, that all about sucked. Wardlow won the TNT title from Samoa Joe at the pay-per-view 3 days prior, just so he could turn around and drop it to Powerhouse Hobbs on the following Dynamite. So I believe we're now up to, what? I think our 4th title switch in the year 2023 alone. And we're only 3 months into the new year, too. I mean, one of my running jokes is that AEW ought to start printing t-shirts that read, "Sucks to be Wardlow." Because that guy's gone to Shaft more times than I care to count. I'm just trying to figure out why the hell they even bothered to switch the title on Sunday. I mean, I kind of had it in the back of my mind. After Hobbs won that ladder match last week on the Go Home show, it kind of seemed obvious that they were setting up Hobbs to win the TNT title, which again is probably why I was really confused with the decision for Joe to lose the belt at the pay-per-view. If you were just going to have Hobbs win the title on Dynamite, if that was the end goal, which with AEW it's impossible to tell, long-term strategic planning my ass, but if the goal was to put the strap on Hobbs, why did you beat Joe at the pay-per-view? Could have gone to the same point by just having Joe be the one to lose to Hobbs. Probably would have made for a better match, too. But you go ahead and tell me what I'm missing. Defend this one till Kingdom fucking come. More power to you. So what did we learn here, class? Well, for one, AEW sucks at recapping pay-per-view. But, I mean, I already knew about that one well over a year ago when they would just constantly gloss over pay-per-views like they were complete afterthoughts. Did they even suggest who might potentially be next in line for MJF? For about 3 minutes, I thought it was Ricky Starks. That was until he randomly got laid out by Juice Robinson for God knows what reason. The whole show, from a formatting standpoint, just left me with a wide list of unanswered questions. Why is Starks now feuding with the Bullet Club? Where did that come from? Why did they change the stipulation of the main event? Why are the JAS randomly in the trios division now? Aside from there are no other teams to work with because that division has sucked since day one. Probably one of my biggest gripes on the entire show, as you came to find out a little bit ago. Why the fuck are Adam Page and Jon Moxley still feuding? Can't get over that. Go away. Seriously. Fuck off. This feud sucks. It's been awful since day one. Move on from it. And then, of course, there was the main event with QT Marshall randomly costing Wardlow the TNT title 3 days after winning it at the pay-per-view. Again, more questions of why. Just, I don't know. That's all I got. The show was a complete waste of time. If you didn't watch the pay-per-view on Sunday night and had no idea what went down, they basically did a good job null and voiding the entire show because they barely addressed anything. I also forgot to mention the Bryan Danielson thing again. Just more questions of what the hell is going on with that whole story. And why did they totally undersell it the moment after it was over? But I guess it's not out of the ordinary for AEW. So what is their next pay-per-view? I'm curious now. Let me see if they even have this scheduled yet. Okay, so Revolution was on Sunday. That was March 5th. Let's see. Well, according to the wiki, looks like Double or Nothing is the next pay-per-view event, which will be taking place on May 28th at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. Well, I mean, they got a couple months, I guess, to piece that show together. But after watching this show, I couldn't tell you what the fuck's going on with that pay-per-view. I don't know, man. It's just... At one point, I used to say that the show would leave me baffled out after it was over. Now, this is just kind of what I come to expect. Because I remember thinking to myself after that pay-per-view was over, are they even going to bother addressing anything that actually went down on the card? Dare they actually take 5 minutes out of the show to show some highlights of the pay-per-view in full? Just maybe touching on some of the key takeaways? Of course, I didn't expect them to do that. Because they never do. Y'all think I'm crazy, but go back in the timeline. Go catch up on any Dynamite episode that follows a pay-per-view. I think the biggest standout to me was that Forbidden Door show last year. Remember that whole period where AEW was bringing in all the New Japan guys for like 4 or 5 weeks straight on television, having them run roughshod over the show and just completely detracting from the product? They did that. Then they booked a pay-per-view with all those random New Japan AEW matches that were completely unmemorable. Following episode of Dynamite, barely addressed it. All the New Japan guys disappeared. They just moved on like nothing ever happened. It's the same thing that happened here. The Revolution pay-per-view came and went, and now they just move on. Hey, they're selling you the quiet part out loud. The pay-per-views really don't matter at the end of the day. And I already could have told you that. I mean, look at the way they structure most of those cards. It's all last-minute booking decisions anyway. Whatever, man. We just move on with the show. So, chugging along through the Crockett archives, that brings us to this March 7th episode, which was just kind of a show. Obviously, that's not to downplay any of the story development throughout the program. In terms of actual on-screen product in the studio, there wasn't a whole lot to go into depth with this one. Again, that's not technically a bad thing. The two big stories centered around Tony and David trying to get a little more in-depth with the current Horseman situation. The opening VTR showed the angle that took place on last week where Tully and Ole got into the brawl by the podium. And Ole had been talked down to earlier in the program by Tully, and those two had a pretty big falling out. JJ was trying to get Ole back on the same page, but that also went sideways. In addition to that, this was the show where we were going to get word on the top 10 seeds for the Senior Memorial Crockett Cup, which is coming up pretty soon, about 4 weeks out as of this current show. Speaking of said teams that would be partaking in the tournament, that brought out Ivan Koloff, Vladimir Pietrov, and Dick Murdoch for a quick promo. Murdoch coming out sporting short ring trunks and an oversized polo, and the polo was so long and droopy, it looked like Murdoch had nothing on from the waist down. And Ivan got on the stick first and did another one of his heat promos on Dusty and Nikita, promising that the Russians would not stop until they rid the superpowers from Crockett Promotions. I liked to hear at the end of his promo, he kind of lost his train of thought and could not figure out how he wanted to conclude it, so he just said, "We're going to put you out, Dusty and Nikita, someplace." Someplace. Very descriptive. Perhaps Mars, for all we know. And then Murdoch got on the mic and did another one of his "I am seething with rage" bad guy promos, screaming about how it doesn't matter what city it takes place in, whether it's Albany, Greensboro, Charlotte, or Jacksonville, Captain Redneck is not going to stop until he beats up Nikita and Dusty and gets all the people to stop chanting their name. Now just picture Dick Murdoch saying that at about 10 times the decibel level. He also uttered something at the end, trying to berate the studio fans. I tried to listen to this back several times to figure out what he said. I believe I heard him refer to the studio crowd as gay heathens. But it is entirely possible I heard that wrong. I also think I've officially found my new favorite heel in Crockett Promotions. Loud, pissed off, boisterous Dick Murdoch. He's the best. Then we went to the ring for our opening match, Lex Luger versus Rocky King. Probably the only jobber in the promotion they could put up against a Horseman and get sympathy on. 95% of the time, the studio crowd is either cheering the Horsemen or reacting to them like they're the biggest babyfaces in the company. I think this also might have been a case where they said, let's take the guys with the two best physiques and let's put them up against each other. Between Luger and Rocky, I believe there was a sum total of about 4% body fat in the ring. God, those guys' physiques were just remarkable. They wrestled for a few minutes. Luger overpowered and slammed Rocky around for a little bit. He eventually went over with the rack. Meanwhile, JJ stood on the outside looking stone-faced. Very perplexed. I can't imagine why. I mean, it's not like the most elite group in all of professional wrestling is disintegrating before his very eyes. I imagine he was undergoing some stress. Naturally, JJ talked about some of this in his follow-up promo. He said that every group of friends goes through their ups and downs. When you travel the road together, you see everybody's individual personalities come out every now and then. But what Ole did last week was an embarrassment to everybody in the group, up to and including himself. And through all that, Lex Luger was right there to stand by JJ's side as the silent enforcer. And Luger kind of restates his mission when he came to Crockett Promotions. Says he came to make a lot of money, win titles, and be a horseman. Says he's the most elite athlete that has ever stepped into the world of sports. Talks about how he didn't make it this far in wrestling just to be seen as an associate of the Horsemen. He wants to be a full-fledged member. He then began rattling off all the five-star tools that he possesses, talking about how agents all across the country wanted to jump aboard the Luger bandwagon, but JJ was the only one that had Luger in his best interest, and he guarantees that he's not going to stop until he becomes an official Horseman member. And by the time this was over, I was incredibly proud of myself for being able to pick up on half of the dialogue from Luger when it was obvious he was visibly winded and blown up trying to get all this out. And then coming back from break, I'll give you 8 guesses as to who was at the podium to do a promo. Okay, I think that was about 8 seconds. If anybody threw out the name Shaska Watley, you deserve an award. I don't even recall the last time I saw Shaska on this program. Not since the dying days of the Paul Jones Army, when he was teaming with Tijo Gijo. But he's back, and he's here to issue a challenge to, of all people, Ron Simmons, who was down in Florida during this period of his career. Shaska says he's going down south to make a name at Ron's expense. He may be a former football player, but Wadley's made a career out of punking out heathens and whooping suckers. He's going to prove that he's too bad to be handled. And, albeit as random as this all came across, it was cool hearing them talk about Ron Simmons. I think he still had about another year or so before they really started pushing him on the bigger shows, because he's been around Crockett Promotions for about a year now, mostly doing underneath feuds and being kept at a prelim level. But he's someone we're going to want to keep an eye on for next year. But, yeah, that's all there was to that. Shaska Wadley is still Shaska Wadley. Then we went to the ring for an MOD squash. They wrestled Mitch Snow and George South. We talked a little bit about the Mod Squad on the special they ran about a month or so ago on television. I believe they showed a match with them and another one of the Central States tag teams at a house show in one of the big cities. I know that was oddly specific. You may better know them as the Jeffers brothers, who were doing squash matches on the studio shows about a year or so before they just went off to Memphis under Jerry Jarrett and kind of revamped their image. They turned heel and started doing the biker gimmick, and eventually they wound back up in the Central States region. Here they were managed by Bill Dundee, who at the time was also doing a lot of back and forth cross promotion in the Central States area. They were mostly an underneath team from what I remember. They also changed their names to Basher and Spike, which was doomed from the start. God, that's like DOA level burial in the WWF when they took Crush, Brian Lee, and the Harris twins and made them Crush, Chains, Skull, and 8-Ball. Just the epitome of burying guys before they ever had a chance to get off the ground. Anyway, the Mod Squad dominated both guys. Spike ended up drilling Snow with a flying elbow for the 3 count. It was their way of trying to let everybody know, well, the Crockett's Cup's coming up soon, so we're going to need some teams to fill the gap somehow. Here are 2 guys that look somewhat menacing. Really nothing to add. And then we came back for a VTR with Tony Schiavone outside the Sabatino's restaurant in Baltimore, which I have heard plenty of interesting stories from Cornette on his podcast, recalling this as one of the stomping ground attractions for the boys back in the territory days. Whenever they would run shows in Baltimore, this would be the location where everybody would go to wine and dine after the shows. And apparently the restaurant is still up and running today, right on a little street corner in downtown Baltimore. Same sign and everything, if you were to go to look up Google images of it. As we found out here, this was the venue where they were hosting the press conference to announce the top 10 seeds in the Crockett Cup. And we had most of the executives in attendance here. I believe all of the managers were included, as well as Jim Cornette, who had his signature tennis racket with him, because of course he did. And they did some opening speeches before revealing the seeds. From number 10 to number 1, here were the list of teams. At number 10, Ivan Koloff and Vladimir Pietrov. Number 9, the Mod Squad. Number 8, Tully Blanchard and Lex Luger. Number 7, Ole and Arn Anderson. Put an asterisk next to that one. I'm pretty sure that changes. Number 6, the Midnight Express, which Cornette proceeded to then flip out and walk out, threw his fork down and said, "Fuck that noise. I'm out of here." Number 6 seed. Ridiculous. Number 5, a Japanese team that had not yet been determined because they were in the middle of a tournament to decide the winning team for that. Yet somehow, whoever that team was, they were still going to be the 5th best team in the top seeds above all the other aforementioned names. For the record, I think one of those names ended up being Giant Baba. Without looking it up, I could not tell you who his partner was. Number 4, the Rock and Roll Express. Number 3, the Road Warriors. Number 2, Dusty Rhodes and Nikita Koloff. And number 1, Rick Rude and Manny Fernandez, which made Paul Jones very happy indeed. He was pitching a fit to Crockett that there would be some backlash if Rude and Bull were not the number 1 seed. So that worked out well in his favor. And then we had Jim Crockett Jr. close things out for the conference by announcing that in addition to the Memorial Cup, we will also have a featured World Heavyweight title match on the second night between Ric Flair and Barry Windham, which, spoiler alert here, is one of my all-time favorite Ric Flair matches. Without a doubt, my favorite of the Flair-Windham matches in their storied rivalry. But, yeah, it was good to get a refresher on that, because I'm looking forward to talking about that match again. As far as the conference itself goes, it was kind of dry in terms of excitement level. Corny getting a little animated in there before storming off was kind of funny, but, you know, it accomplished what it needed to. You look at the seeds here and you think, man, it's nice to go back in a time when wrestling tag teams were really good. Exclude Vladimir Pietrov from the conversation. But all those money matchups and big-time programs for years and years they could build on. This is the best time to be a fan of tag team wrestling, no doubt. And if anybody thinks it's remotely compatible in today's climate, you're lying to yourself. So coming back from break, we had Mike Rotunda versus Thunderfoot number 1. I think it was number 1. May have been number 2. Or it could have been Thunderfoot number 3, 4, 5, 6, 12, 17. And if you're wondering to yourself, why the emphasis on Mike Rotunda? Well, apparently David Crockett didn't catch wind of the fact that we're not in the WWF. Therefore, his name was back to Mike Rotunda in Crockett Promotions, not Mike Rotundo, which is what he constantly referred to him as here. Every single time I heard David refer to him as Rotundo, I winced. It was cool hearing a Sir Oliver Humperdinck reference. I think that was based on them talking about Rotunda's work in Florida. And I think Humperdinck was in Florida around this time in 87. Actually, maybe he wasn't. When did Humperdinck go to the WWF? I can't remember. I know he wound back up in Crockett Promotions in the late 80s. God, so much of this stuff blends together over the years. It's hard to keep track of who was in what territory or region. Anyway, I didn't write much down about this. Rotunda won with an airplane spin DVD combo. It was mildly more impressive than the work I've seen from him in the WWF as IRS. I think that mainly boils down to the fact that I always preferred plain old Mike Rotunda over the fake tax collector gimmick. But maybe that's just me being a stick in the mud and hating all the artificial cartoon characters of the early to mid-90s. Afterwards, they went to the booth for a Tim Horner Rotunda promo, just to kind of remind us that they're going to be one of the seeds in the Crockett Cup tournament, which is probably good that they reminded us because I already forgot about that. Horner talked for a minute. He said that every day he wakes up, he goes over to his calendar and crosses off another day as he's counting down to the 10th and 11th of April. I snidely wrote down in my notes, I highly doubt that is a thing that Tim Horner actually did. And if so, he needs to come up with better hobbies. Then Rotunda said that he's coming after the Florida Heavyweight Championship. I believe his exact words were, I don't know who is currently holding on to the belt, but I'm coming for it. Word. For the record, I had no clue who the world champion was in the CWF by the year 1987. I'm sure Wikipedia knows the answer, but the fact that even Mike Rotunda did not know who the champion was prior to this promo, and he was the one that was apparently going for it, must not have been that important. Then we came back for a Superstar Bill Dundee Mod Squad promo. Dundee put over the fact that the Jeffers brothers were the number 9 seed. He said something about how him and the Barbarian had their own invitation to the tournament. kind of forgot about that too. The fact that Dundee and Barbarian were paired together for a brief run in 87. Then one of the Jeffers brothers, couldn't tell if it was Spike or Masher, but he made some comments about how when they were in the police force, they ended up getting discharged because they were, quote, too brutal. And now that they're in the wrestling business, they're going to get paid to brutalize some bodies. Then the other Mod Squad brother talked about all the cool stuff they could buy with $1 million should they wind up winning the Crockett Cup. And I can confirm 100% that by the time this was over, I was not convinced that the Mod Squad was winning the 1987 Crockett Cup. But it was a good effort. Going back to the ring, Arn Anderson wrestled Mike Jackson for a few minutes. Probably the most notable thing about it was Tony and David trying to give Arn the gimmick name Stone Cold Arn Anderson, referring to his stone cold facial expressions and button-down stern attitude. Man, the only thing I could think was, what if Arn actually tried to take the name Stone Cold Arn Anderson? Could they have ever gotten him under the same roof to do some business with Steve Austin? That would have been awesome. Come to think of it, was there actually ever a period where Steve Austin and Arn Anderson crossed paths? I don't think there was. It's disappointing. Anyway, Anderson won with the double A spine buster. It was a match that existed, short and sweet. Then we went back to the booth for a Tully, JJ, and Luger promo. More accurately, it was a Tully Blanchard venting session, while JJ and Luger just kind of stood in the background and gave Tully the floor. And it was a hell of a promo. Basically doing the promo on Ole Anderson, referencing everything that happened last week, talking about how Ole has spent more time away from television in the last year, mostly with that snot-nosed punk kid of his, saying that when Ole actually did show up to TV, he was falling behind the rest of the Horsemen. All he's done is weigh the group down recently, whether it's not showing up, not going to the gym. He takes him to the woodshed for putting his hands on JJ, cheap-shotting him on TV in front of everybody. He knows better than anybody that the Horsemen don't cheap-shot. They settle their business in the ring like men. By the way, howled at that line about the Horsemen never reverting to cheap shots. What a fucking heel line. And he basically concluded all this by telling Ole that he can think about it when he's sitting at breakfast not being able to feed his snot-nosed kid because he's financially broke and can't make enough money to make ends meet. All because he chose the wrong path. He chose a kid over his own brothers. But that wasn't all, because we came back from break to get Arn's input on everything that's gone down. He's been pretty quiet over the last 7 days, but now's his time to speak his mind and let everybody know where he stands. Obviously, he talks about how he came into Crockett Promotions a little over a year ago as a pretty under-the-radar unknown, and his goal from day one was to establish himself and carry on the legacy of the Anderson family. And through all that, Ole always stood by his side, made sure that Arn was well taken care of. But for Arn, the downhill slide all dated back to Starrcade 86, when Ole did the job in the cage match with the Rock and Roll Express. Arn didn't see the passion and fire in Ole's eyes. All Ole could think about was his son. Meanwhile, Arn, the other side of his family, he took a back seat on one of the most important nights of his career. And he's here in 1987 having to reestablish himself, all because Ole dropped the ball. So as far as Arn is concerned, yeah, he will always be an Anderson brother. But more importantly, he'll be a Horseman first and foremost. And as he goes about reestablishing his career and building himself back up, his first goal is to go after Nikita Koloff in the United States heavyweight title. It's a bold move. I also coined the two previous promos from Tully and Arn the two best promos of their entire career. And I know I say that after virtually every Horseman promo, especially when Tully's the one talking. But I don't think I'm exaggerating. That might be an actual statement of fact. And as for Ole's future, no, at least as far as the Horsemen go, he's definitely in the doghouse. We've heard everybody's input, with the exception of one man, and his name is Ric Flair. We still have to hear his thoughts on everything that's gone down in this mess of a situation. And if there's one thing we all know about the Nature Boy, if it doesn't involve booze, clothes, or fucking, he's probably ambivalent. But we are also talking about friendship, so I presume Flair will have something to share. In the meantime, let's go to the ring for our junior heavyweight title match. It's Denny Brown defending against Lasertron. And no, you did not hear me misspeak. That was a thing they booked. I had zero memory that there was ever a gimmick in Crockett Promotions known as Lasertron. I remember RoboCop pretty vividly, mostly because it was infamously terrible. Lasertron, though, that one's up there. And even better, when I did a quick Google search and found out that Lasertron was actually Hector Guerrero under a mask, I started laughing. Because then I started having flashbacks to the gobbledygooker and realized, God, that poor Hector. He couldn't catch a break in the business. You talk about intentional career sabotage. They had it out for that guy since day one. Write that one down, kids. It wasn't the gobbledygooker that forever killed Hector's career in wrestling. Lasertron. Yeah, that preceded it. I have to presume that there was a backstory behind this. Why they felt the need to have a masked character in Crockett Promotions called Lasertron beats the hell out of me. Didn't fool the crowd, though. There were a handful of people that were blatantly calling him Hector. They saw right through that. Let it be known that in the year 1987, the wrestling fans could always see through the bullshit gimmicks. The match wasn't bad, despite the intentional burial of Hector. The crowd actually really warmed up to Lasertron as the match went along. I mean, he was still doing all the regular Hector moves, which everybody liked. You could also maybe tie that in with the fact that he was wrestling Denny Brown, which, I mean, no offense to the guy, but it's Denny fucking Brown. They actually gave this a lot of time, too, which I thought was actually surprising. Hector took like 80% of the offense. Denny Brown tried to cut Hector off momentarily at the end, but they ended up doing a cool, flashy spot where Denny flipped Hector overhead in a backdrop position, but Hector springed up and landed on his feet. Ended up hitting the ropes and catching Denny with a flying elbow to get the upset win. So in his debut match, Lasertron won the NWA Junior Heavyweight Championship. And the people popped big for the title switch. Again, it was a perfectly fine match. Jim Cornette thought otherwise, because when they put the camera on the Midnights afterwards, Corny was pretending to yawn. But, yeah, there you have it. New Junior Heavyweight Champion. After like a year of Denny Brown carrying that title around throughout the entire NWA region. I had completely forgotten about that title until Brown randomly showed up like a week ago to wrestle that match with Rocky King. So then they throw him out a week later. They just have him drop the strap. I thought that was kind of amusing. Hey, Denny, I know you've been champion for about 12 months now, but you're going to drop the belt this week to Hector Guerrero under a mask. Probably thought to himself, fuck off. Going back to Corny and the Midnights for a minute. Corny ran down the conspiracy theory of Jim Crockett fucking them in the tournament for the second year in a row, booking them at the number 6 seed instead of number 1, like they so richly deserve. He runs down all the babyface teams that are seated above them, while at the same time half-heartedly putting over Bull and Rude as the number 1 seed, because he's a heel. There was a part in this promo where they actually blurred out a few seconds of audio when Cornette was mouthing off about the Japanese guys. I have no earthly clue what the hell he said, but whatever it was definitely not suited for television. And after he vowed that the Midnights would win the tournament, he also ran down the Garvin brothers again, told Jimmy that if he doesn't watch his back, he might have a cosmic fireball waiting to singe off his beard. He also called out Precious and did another one of his misogynistic women only belong barefoot in the kitchen heat promos. Talked about how women don't belong in the sport of wrestling, and he's always felt that way. No comment. On the subject of Rude and Bull, they were out with Paul Jones to boast about being the number 1 seed. And generally was a very basic promo with not a whole lot to take away. Really didn't write much down. Except for one thing, where Rick Rude at one point claimed that he and Bull were going to have a good time, quote, rubbing out the competition in the tournament. I'll just leave that one hanging. You can all interpret that as you wish. That was followed by Jimmy Valiant beating Tommy Angel in another match that I wrote absolutely nothing down of interest. Eye gouge, hair pull, wacky dance, arm wrench, illegal choke, Tony Schiavone, elbow drop, 1, 2, 3. In that order. Then we had the return of one of my favorites, the bar bearing. Damn, we really needed Paul Jones to give him the intro here. I mean, Bill Dundee was fine, but it doesn't get much better than Paul Jones referring to him as the bar bearing. But yes, he's back. Void of the stain that was the Paul Jones army, having to stand alongside Shaska Watley and the Baron and Tijo Gijo, all the horrible comedy acts. Now he is, well, for however long this lasts, it's not a long time, a temporary muscle for superstar Bill Dundee, as he's now on a quest to beat up Handsome Jimmy in Orlando during the next Crockett tour, because the superstar does not like rednecks. He hates everything that Handsome Jimmy represents. He hates the Jack Daniels drinking, the low-rent pickup trucks. Most importantly, he cannot stand the fact that Jimmy Valiant is nothing more than a cosplay wrestler. He says that when the music hits, Jimmy can do all the shucking and jiving, but when it comes bell time, Jimmy doesn't know a wrist lock from a wrist watch. There's a classic corny line. Now I finally get the reference. And he promised that whether it's him or the Barbarian, Jimmy Valiant doesn't stand a chance when he gets in the ring with them in Florida. And then they send poor old Randy Mulkey out there to get destroyed by the Barbarian. The best rib in the entire history of Crockett Promotions. Watching the Mulkey twins get sent out there to be sacrificial lambs on TV every week. Never gets old. Barbarian ate the guy's lunch. Picked him up, dropped him all over the place, threw him around like a sack of potatoes. Randomly deciding to break out a sharpshooter at one point, which I thought was kind of amusing. Mostly because the Barbarian put the sharpshooter on Randy, and then he just broke the hold and proceeded to beat him up some more. After which, he scooped Randy up and hit him with a tombstone pile driver, and then he killed him with a diving headbutt for good measure. As if Randy wasn't already dead after just having his head drilled into the mat. Nah, I got to make sure we have the Barbarian get him with that diving headbutt for reassurance. Best squash of all time. That is since the last time I determined a match the best squash of all time. Then we came back for a Superpowers promo. Nikita out of the gate apologizing for his not-so-dashing appearance. He and Dusty just got back from a big tour around the country, visiting some of the cities that Nikita's never wrestled in before down south, including some great broken English from Nikita trying to pronounce Chattanooga with a Russian accent. That was funny. And he also covered the Crockett Cup briefly, promised that he and Dusty were coming after Dick Murdoch, Ivan Koloff, and Vladimir Pietrov. Dusty sort of restated those talking points. He honestly didn't have much to say. He told Murdoch and the Russians that he hopes they can hang around long enough in the tournament to see Dusty and Nikita win the money and the trophy, because the revenge and the sting will be that much sweeter. And then for our totally random why the fuck was this booked match, Baron von Raschke and Wahoo McDaniel wrestled Rick Sullivan and Randy Barber. Okay, first off, why? Second off, simply put, I nodded off during this match. No offense to Baron and Wahoo. I mean, Baron's matches usually put me into a coma when he's wrestling by himself. But him teaming with Wahoo McDaniel, another guy that really doesn't do a whole lot for me when I watch him work. Yeah, I kind of clocked out for a piss break during this. Normally it doesn't happen with the Crockett shows. I'm usually glued from start to finish watching these things, but as soon as I saw the graphic on screen that read Wahoo McDaniel and Baron von Raschke versus Rick Sullivan and Randy Barber, I said, yeah, maybe I can go drain the cow now. Chances are I'm not going to miss much. Turns out I didn't. Baron got the win with the claw. And then Baron did a quick promo after the break, which was slightly more exciting than the match that I skipped over. He talked about how Jim Cornette made a mistook when he set fire to Ronnie Garvin's face. He poked fun that the Horsemen were falling apart as a unit. Then he talked about Dick Murdoch turning on him and all his friends and siding with the Russians made him a turncoat traitor. And he vowed that next week in Jacksonville, Murdoch would pay when he and the rest of the Russians would face Baron, Dusty, and Nikita in a cage. He also made a Lee Harvey Oswald reference, which went completely over my head. I then began picturing in my mind the idea of what a six-man cage match would look like, with Ivan, Pietrov, and Murdoch wrestling Dusty, Nikita, and the Baron all at the same time. Whew. Poor Jacksonville fans. Hope they got their money back on those tickets. Speaking of the Devils, they all wrestled Alan Martin, Zane Smith, and Cougar J in a six-man squash. And no, I'm not making that name up. Cougar J. Just add that to the list of horrible job guy names next to Jack Jackson and Chance McQuaid. This was also hideously boring. They strategically kept Pietrov on the apron for most of the match. When he did tag in, here are the following things he attempted to do, but utterly failed. A big boot off the ropes where he barely grazed the guy's chest. Something that looked like he was attempting a full Nelson suplex, but then he just sort of dropped the guy and gave up. And a very sloppy, reckless throw into the corner. And keep in mind, this guy was being advertised for a cage match with 5 other dudes. How in the fuck anybody got out of that match alive is beyond me. The fans were also having a fun time heckling Murdoch, calling him traitor. That was probably my main takeaway from the segment, aside from Vladimir Pietrov just being a rotten pro wrestler. He also got the win for his team with a horrible-looking sickle. Still couldn't execute that move right to save his life. Awful. Barry Windham wrestled Chance McQuaid. My God, these fucking studio job guys. Who came up with these names? Was Dusty actively ribbing these guys intentionally? Or did they actually think these guys would get over with those names? Barry won with a running clothesline. He also had a very quick post-match promo, hyping up his world title match with Ric Flair at the Crockett Cup. Tells Flair that he better get ready because this is a huge opportunity for Windham, and he's not about to let it slip away from him. And like I addressed earlier, it was my favorite of all the Flair-Windham title matches. I don't know, there was just something about that particular match that stood out above the rest. I'm excited. Going to get to talk about that in a month or so. Coming back, Brad Armstrong was at the booth for a promo. He's hyping up his upcoming rematch with Tully Blanchard for the World's Television title at the following night's Sunday show. Last time these guys met in the ring, it ended in a time limit draw. I believe that was the one they aired on the Saturday Superstation. It was a hell of a title match from what I remember. So, yeah, the rematch is signed. And it's also for the $10,000 that Tully has been putting up in all of his title matches. Except for the one he's had recently with Brad because, well, Tully's a coward. But, yeah, hopefully we'll see some highlights of that match on next week's show because that sounds like a lot of fun. And then for our main event, Ronnie and Jimmy Garvin teamed up for the first time on television. They took on Larry Stevens and Daryl Dalton. It's another pretty groundbreaking moment in the archives of the Jim Crockett shows. I mean, we've seen Ronnie and Jimmy out there doing promos, but now they're actually meeting to wrestle as a team. And, that makes sense because they were one of the seeds in the 87 Crockett Cup. Obviously, in addition to Tony and David covering the fact that the Garvins were going to be part of the tournament, they also talked about the cage showdown that is upcoming between Ronnie and Jim Cornette, basically promising that Ronnie was going to stretch and humiliate Corny in front of God and everybody. Kind of like how Ronnie did the same to Larry Stevens here, bending and twisting and torquing him in ways that I don't think the human body was ever meant to bend. And after a few minutes of Jimmy and Ronnie beating these two bumbling buffoons up, Ronnie won with the knockout punch to Daryl, where in the replay we saw Daryl's man boobs jiggle up and down as he took the bump. It was grotesque yet hilarious at the same time. Then they rounded out the show with a closing promo. Jim Garvin restated a lot of his previous talking points from the last couple weeks, put over Ronnie, and talked about how he appreciated all the fan support when he was making his recovery. He says he goes to bed and wakes up every morning thinking of all the ways Ronnie's going to pummel Cornette into oblivion. And while Corny may try to insinuate that his lawyers are going to bail him out of this cage match, it ain't going to happen. And Ronnie promised Cornette that when he gets inside that cage, he's never going to forget that beating for as long as he lives. Which actually turned out to be true in some instance, because Corny still talks about that cage match to this day. Even though he's talked about how well Ron took care of him in that match and that he barely laid a finger on him. But he made it look so convincing. Granted, they were a little pressed for time here in the promo, so Ronnie was kind of rushed at the end. But that was kind of the gist of it. It is kind of funny how one of their big main selling draws for 1987 is Ronnie Garvin beating up the manager of the Midnight Express. That's how much fucking heat the guy had back in the day. Think about that. The fact that people were willing to dish out money to see one of the top babyfaces, soon to be the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, beat up the manager of a tag team. And everybody was willing to buy a ticket to see it happen. That's heat. That is real honest-to-God heat, man. Can you imagine a scenario in today's business where something like that could ever happen again? I sure can't. The closest thing I could think is maybe seeing Cody Rhodes try to go after Paul Heyman. But they'd have to drum up a lot of heat for that. That also means we'd probably have to see Paul Heyman work. And I like Paul E, but let's be blunt. Working was never one of his stronger attributes. But Ron Garvin versus Jim Cornette, one of the biggest programs in '87. Hard to imagine something like that would ever occur again in the business. It's good stuff, man. It's really good stuff. So, moving into world-class programming for the week. Guess you could say we were back to business as usual, which is weird. I don't even really like saying that, considering last week's episode was the David von Erich tribute. It was kind of strange to go from that, and now 1 week later, they're right back to standard television programming. And I'll be pretty blunt with this one. There wasn't a whole lot I wrote down about these matches. Like, we had a few new names that showed up, but as a whole, the show really didn't have a whole lot going on in terms of story advancement. Most of the segments were pretty basic and kind of what we come to expect with the Dallas programs. Not particularly exciting, very dry, but it does the job. You know, everything flows from week to week very well. Everything makes sense. It's probably my biggest pet peeve when it comes to watching wrestling anymore. How often is it the case that I just constantly come on here and talk about how shit never makes sense? It's like, it never has to be that complex. I don't need people blowing each other up with dynamite every week or sodomizing someone's dead dog in the parking lot. I just want stories to tie together in some form or fashion. Just logic, coherency. It's hard to come by these days. The opener for this week was Chick Donovan versus Mike Bond. I believe our first sighting of Chick Donovan on Dallas TV. I'd have to comb over my notes again from previous TV reports, but I don't think we've seen Donovan show up to wrestle in World Class yet. You know, sadly, another one of those wrestlers that was a little before my time, so my knowledge of his background in wrestling is kind of limited. I think everybody remembers him for having a pretty notable run in Memphis when he was in Jimmy Hart's first family. And that's going back to 80, 81. So if you happen to stumble across any of the old CWA tapes anywhere on YouTube, you might be able to catch clips of Chick Donovan working some of those TV matches. I know he was around other areas too throughout his career. You know, we always talk about how there are certain guys that hop and bounce around from territory to territory and never really stay put in one particular area. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Chick was wrestling as of 92, 93, or 94 when he was doing underneath stuff in WCW. He wasn't really pushed anywhere above the lower tier status, but I mean, he was still working by that point too. God, by now he's got to be, pushing 70? Because I think even by the point he was in Dallas, I mean, he wasn't a young tyker. He was really trying to sport the Ric Flair look. Bill Mercer kept trying to compare him to Michael Hayes. I have no idea what he was smoking. I saw no resemblance to the Hayes look. He had the full Ric Flair look going on here. Great shape, too. I mean, they built him at 240 for this match. Probably could have gone away with 250 or 260. Match was all right. It was a Chick Donovan showcase for the most part, but they let Bond get in a little bit of offense. It was funny hearing Mercer constantly refer to how much Chick enjoyed hanging out at the beach, surfing, just randomly going back to this as a main talking point throughout the match and trying to compare Chick's work to something pertaining to beaches and surfing. Chick Donovan with such a great physique. One might call it a beach physique. In other words, he hit the gym more than 3 times a week. Chick hit some back body drops toward the end. Bond tried to whip Chick off the ropes, but he came back and won with a diving crossbody attack. Again, very simple, not a whole lot to it. I don't know how long Chick Donovan sticks around with World Class. A lot of guys came and went so quickly, it's hard to remember who was in what territory at a given time, but I guess that'll be another name we can keep on the radar as we progress through the library. Then we came back for our second bout. Kelly Kiniski wrestled Gentleman Chris Adams. Now, we have seen Kiniski wrestle a couple times, so while he is relatively new to the scene, we've at least seen him work on television. In his debut match, I could have sworn he was a babyface. Here, he was a full-fledged heel going up against Chris Adams. One of the stories they talked about here was the fact that Jimmy Garvin had broken into Adams' locker room and stole his American heavyweight title. I guess he just casually walked in while Adams was out to take a leak or something and just picked up the belt and walked out with it. Very stealth-like. Wish we could have seen some hidden camera footage of Jimmy Garvin going all in with the Looney Tunes comedy and trying to quietly tiptoe into Adams' dressing room to steal the title belt. Sadly, we didn't get that. They also gave this match a little bit of time. Both guys are pretty back and forth for a lot of it, even though the crowd was very much behind Adams. But they tried to lay the match out so Kiniski could get a little bit of shine. A lot of go, Chris, go chants. All of it was pretty standard stuff until Gorgeous Jimmy and Precious came out at the end to add a little bit of color to the segment. Starting with Garvin walking over to the corner to try and distract Adams by flexing his muscles. Just acting like a total pompous jackass. And after Adams failed on a couple roll-up attempts, Garvin started spitting in Chris's general direction long enough so Kiniski could then sneak in the back door and cradle him to get the pin. And then, with Garvin doing his best Scott Farkas impression, he begins obnoxiously laughing as loud as he possibly could. But the fun didn't end there, because Garvin then got up on the apron after Adams tried to paintbrush him from the floor. He ended up getting yanked into the ring by his hair. Then Garvin's managed to fight back. He tied Adams' arms to the ring ropes, and he showed off the stolen American title belt. Also, Sunshine could then sneak in the back door to run a brief distraction. And when Garvin teased that he was going to smack Sunshine, Adams broke free, and he turned around and hit Jimmy Garvin with the super kick, and he took his title back. And the crowd pissed themselves like they literally just witnessed a title change occur in front of their very eyes. And just to add insult to injury, Adams got back in the ring, and he began ripping off Garvin's clothing. I was very thankful that Adams was at least kind enough to let Garvin keep his trunks on. But, at least he got the belt back. By the way, great heat angle. They talk about how Jimmy Garvin stole the American heavyweight title, and then Adams just gets it back 1 week later in a random TV angle. Think they maybe could have milked that for a while longer? Just saying. Then we had Hacksaw Butch Reed versus Mike Reed. Guess they just figured, hey, got 2 Reeds. May as well book them together in a match. That won't confuse the people or anything. And man, Hacksaw Butch Reed. God, there's a name that doesn't get talked about enough in the business. What can you say about that guy that hasn't already been covered by the experts? The term underrated talent gets thrown around a lot in the business. Maybe for his time especially, you can certainly put him up there at the top of the list, man. Obviously the first time I saw him, we're probably going back to his run in Mid-South from 83 to 86. that's where I really think he got put on the map and became a recognized talent. The one thing that Butch Reed always had going in his favor was the fact that he was great at working both sides of the aisle, be it face or heel. I mean, his heel promos were some of the better promos you were going to find in the territory days. And you go back and watch him in the ring, considering that he was a big guy, probably 260, at least 6'3". Obviously, he was a former college football player in the 70s. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he actually signed a contract with one of the National Football League teams. It was like a major deal, too. And he was like early 20s, I think. And I don't think it ever went far before he switched over to pro wrestling. But, God, I could fucking delve into a rabbit hole discussion about Butch Reed's Mid-South run. The early stuff with him and Duggan, when Duggan was still a heel, teaming with DiBiase, him and JYD as a team. Then a little later on, when Reed turned heel for the first time on TV and had that great feud with Duggan, who I think was a babyface by that point too. It was kind of like one of those double turns. The work he did with Magnum TA. Obviously, you got to throw Buddy Landell into the conversation too. Those guys were a riot together on television. Not everything was always a home run for him. I try not to bring up the whole Master G thing, because that was just fucking brutal. That was by the time Dog left for the WWF and Bill Watts was still trying to look for his top black babyface replacement. He experimented with several guys around that time. Most of them flopped pretty badly. Sonny King being the other name. Brickhouse Brown probably being another name. It was up and down for him there. The WWF run, I also try to erase from memory. Thankfully, I didn't see a lot of that growing up, so I can pretend a lot of it didn't happen. But yeah, Butch Reed. He's another guy that gets thrown around as a name that probably should have had a bigger impact in the business than he did. And it's easy enough to say, yeah, you could say that for 1,400 other guys in the business that had the it factor and never got the chance to reach their fullest potential. And arguably, that's probably true. But Butch Reed was just a really sad case. Because again, you take one look at the guy. He had all the tools, the size, the charisma, the promo ability, the working ability. It was all there. Just for whatever reason, it never fully clicked like it should have. Part of it could have been timing. Part of it could have been the fact that he was another guy that moved around from place to place and never really stayed in one company for an extended period. But, man, it sucks. Because he was, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, early 30s when he went to the WWF. The guy had plenty of time left in his career by that point. Vince could have given him a bigger push. Yeah, I know, right? Say that about a laundry list of names that have come and gone in the WWF. Guys that Vince could have done a better job with. You could talk for years and years about that. Then we had a little shameless plug part of the program. The Freebirds plugging their Bad Street USA album, which I believe dropped not all that recently. And if you thought for a second that Michael Hayes wasn't going to take pride in showboating this to the Dallas faithful, obviously you don't know Michael Hayes that well. And it's like, I've heard this shit so many times throughout the years. While it's not my particular flavor of old school 70s, 80s rock, it still slaps. And it's so Michael Hayes, man. His vocals are beyond atrocious. Literally could not sing a fucking lick. But, it's one of those things where the guy had so much charisma, he could get away with it. Admittedly so. I'll take this over most of the generic music we hear in wrestling today, where everybody's got interchangeable music and nothing ever stands out. Unless the fans actually take it upon themselves to get music over on their own accord. see Seth Rollins or I guess Chris Jericho's Judas in AEW, even though that song is fucking rotten beyond all hope. Jericho's vocals are, I mean, they're passable by comparison to Michael Hayes, but I still hate that song with a passion. Long before Jericho ever started using it as theme music, just so you know I'm not biased. But like I said with Bad Street, you know, if you weren't sick of hearing it after the first few go-arounds, get ready to hear this thing spammed left, right, and center, because you're going to be hearing a lot of it from now until basically the end of their run as a group. I think they would use other music sporadically, but this was definitely their mainstay. Bad Street USA. It is a catchy tune, but overplayed. I think we could just leave it at that. We got more of it in their entrance as they came out for the main event. It is Terry Gordy versus Kevin Von Erich. And it was indeed Terry Gordy versus Kevin Von Erich. I think I reviewed this exact same match at least 187 different times in the last 5 months alone. Same case as we talk about with every Freebirds Von Erich match. Crowd nutted themselves anytime Kevin hit an offensive move on Gordy. Gordy was a great bumping machine the whole time. At the point Kevin got the claw locked in on Gordy for the first time, they put the camera on an older gentleman in the front row that was way too excited to see this claw move applied, pumping his fist like a wild man. And all of it boils over at the end where Kevin and Gordy get tied up in the corner. David Manning is trying to pry both guys apart, but after he gets sideswiped a few times, Manning calls for the bell and disqualifies both men. And eventually all the underneath guys file out from the locker room to try and separate everybody. That also did not go over very well. And finally, they're able to hold guys back long enough for Hayes to get Gordy out and basically tell him to fight another day. Among the list of whatever I just said a minute ago, 187 Von Erich Freebirds matches, this probably ranked at like the 184th best match they've ever had. I mean, to be fair, the whole thing went like 5 minutes, so they really didn't have a whole lot of time to work with. But as I talk about every time they do one of these matches, man, the people are hot for it. It's kind of weird how they can just do this match nonstop for 2 or 3 years straight, and the people would never get sick of it. Can't say I was too hot for the show as a whole. Obviously, I had fun talking about some of the names that came up here, Butch Reed being one of the biggest. But as a show, like I mentioned at the top, it was nah. Not a lot of big story development. Yeah, the wrestling was solid. Again, I talked about it, though, at the beginning. It was just weird as a follow-up from last week's show. They did that hour-long David tribute, and then they followed up 7 days later with a lot of underneath or mid-card guys. A pretty underwhelming Kevin Gordy main event that only got a few minutes. You know, as I said, though, it's the Ken Mantell booking principle. You know, everything's very formulaic and simple in terms of show structure. Nothing's ever going to insult your intelligence or make you want to reach for a brick and throw it through your TV monitor. But the shows are very dry, not the most engaging programs every week. There are angles that are sprinkled in here and there, and, you know, sometimes we get those classic moments that we talk about for months, i.e. Jimmy Garvin cleaning up horse shit in the barn stalls. But, you know, beyond that, very simple programming with Dallas TV. If you're a more modern wrestling fan of the younger generation, you'd probably fall asleep watching a lot of these shows. And I get it. You know, I've dozed off a time or two with these shows, and I've actually had to go back and rewatch a couple things that I missed. It happens. But as I've said many times, man, for the wrestling that I enjoy, the stuff that I grew up watching as a kid, this formula never gets old. I mean, yeah, I watch a lot of headlocks, but At least I know what the fuck is going on from week to week. And I'm not left wondering how they get from point A to point B to point C with the booking. They also show recap packages, which greatly helps. All the things I wish I could get with AEW, but I've been barking up that rotting tree since 2019. So, I guess it'd be a good time to kind of close things out for this one. So, as I noted at the beginning of the podcast, this weekend is actually just going to be the SmackDown review. There will be no Retro Raw report, but that will give me enough time to sit down and actually watch the WrestleMania 10 pay-per-view. So, yeah, works out that way. And next week will be a very packed Monday show, most definitely. And I think that's all I really got for this one. So, thanks all for stopping in, tuning in. Again, you can check us out on YouTube or Rumble. We are here on Monday and Friday every single week. So, stop by if you have some free time. Greatly would appreciate the support in any way that you can. Take care, all. See you soon. Peace out.